So thanks everyone for coming, and thank you to the organizers. It's great to be here, at least virtually, and we're excited to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing recently. So I'm going to start with a brief motivation and some context for the work that we've been doing on environmental inequality, and then Jay will present the rest of the results, or the results rather, from our recent paper. Okay, so let's get going. So in terms of environmental inequality and its sort of place in the United States, it's recently returned to the national stage, largely as part of the conversation on race and inequality in America. But it's not a new issue. It's a conversation that's been going on now for decades. So to give you an example, in 1978, 31,000 gallons of polychlorinated biphenyl, known as PCB, were illegally dumped along 210 miles of roads in 14 counties in North Carolina. And so, just back please, Jay. Jay, back slide. Jay.
Thank you. Have done. It's delayed, sorry.
Okay, sorry. So just to give you some context on what PCBs are, they're highly toxic and they're carcinogenic. They don't break down or degrade, and so this means that they're easily transferable. When they're in the soil, they can get transferred into the water very easily and then into the atmosphere through evaporation. And once they enter the body through consumption of food or water, they remain in our body. They're stored and remain in the fats. And so this is bad. PCB exposure has been shown to cause liver damage, neurological damage, and cancer. So all in all, it's nasty stuff, and they definitely shouldn't have been dumping it on the side of the road. Okay, so in response, North Carolina developed a plan to collect and properly dispose of all of the PCB contaminated soil in a landfill site. And the landfills had to be within the counties where the dumping occurred. They had to be surrounded by at least 16 acres of land, and they had to be isolated from highly populated areas. So two counties that satisfied these requirements were Chatham County and Warren County in the north of North Carolina. The Chatham County site was publicly owned and clay-lined, which significantly reduced the likelihood that PCB would leak into the surrounding soil. By contrast, the Warren County site was a private foreclosure on a shallow water table, water from which was pumped by local residents. So before we go any further, we're going to do a quick poll. So which site do you think would be most appropriate for storing the PCB contaminated soil? Apparently I can answer the, oh, I can't vote. I thought I got to vote them. Okay, so the votes are coming in, hopefully. Okay, and we see, okay, so 95% think that the Chatham County site was most appropriate. Good. All right, so before we tell you which site was chosen, first we're going to look at a couple of demographic characteristics for the two counties. We see that Chatham County was 72% white, while Warren County was 37% white. Looking at the poverty rate, we see that Warren County was 6 times more, had a poverty rate which was 6 times higher than Chatham County. If we move to the next slide. And so the question is, which site do you think was chosen now? So let's do a poll on that. There we go. So have your priors changed? How optimistic are you? Okay, so the opposite of what people thought, was the most appropriate site. 96% people now saying that Warren County was the one that was chosen. Previously, 95% thought that Chatham County was the most appropriate. So We have I think one or two optimists that are really hoping that Chatham County was chosen. So unfortunately, the Warren County site was chosen. This caused a lot of problems, as it should. There was an uproar. Widespread protests happened, gaining the attention of civil rights groups and the national media. And for all intents and purposes, this was the birth of the environmental justice movement in the United States. And it's long been understood that disadvantaged communities are disproportionately exposed to lower levels of environmental quality and greater environmental risks. However, much of our understanding about environmental inequality has been shaped by evidence based on stationary sources of pollution, like landfill sites or toxic waste sites, and has been based on local case study evidence and usually measured at a snapshot in time. And many of those sources of environmental risk are less salient, they're less sort of noticeable. And so while local case, and secondly, while local case study evidence provides detailed information about a specific context at a given point in time, it's harder to generalize and get a broader understanding of the issues. So what our work has been focused on recently is to build a systematic understanding of environmental quality measures and understanding of environmental inequality across time and space. And so at this point, Jay, who will tell you a little bit more about some of our recent work in this space.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. I should mention to the participants that we are accepting questions at any point in time through the Q&A. We will get to as many as we can after our prepared remarks are finished. So please feel free to submit questions at any time. So it's worth noting that, as Jonathan noted, we're interested in more systematically characterizing environmental disparities across space and across time. And we recently had a paper published in Science magazine along these lines that highlights our approach in the context of fine particulate matter air pollution. So before we go any further, for those of you that are unfamiliar, it probably makes some sense to give you a flavor of what we mean by fine particulate matter. So PM 2.5 or fine particulate matter is particles suspended in the air that are 40 times smaller than a grain of sand. Because they're so small, they readily enter our lungs, bloodstream, and brain. And because they do so, the health and consequently economic consequences are very pronounced. They include things like infant death, reduced life expectancy among adults, cancer, lung disease, heart disease, lost labor productivity, reduced lifetime earnings, and a host of other consequences. So what we're going to do is consider sort of a systematic approach to thinking about disparities in these fine particulate matter concentrations. So the first point of departure is data. So we compiled pretty rich data on PM 2.5 concentrations in the United States. We analyzed data observed at each of 8.6 million distinct locations. That's about a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer square in the United States for each and every year over the 4 decades, or roughly 4 decades, spanning 1981 to 2016. These particular fine particulate matter measurements are derived from remote sensing products, typically satellite data, also ground monitoring station data, and chemical transport models. So armed with these fairly amazing data, we are able to paint an incredibly detailed picture of particulate air pollution concentrations for each of 65,000 US census tracts, which we'll loosely refer to as neighborhoods, every single year since 1981. And the key punchline of what we're going to find is pretty straightforward, but was not previously known, which is fine particulate air pollution has fallen substantially since 1981. We knew that, but relative disparities persist. So what does that mean? Let's basically get into that. First, it may be useful to start with some good news. So the good news is that average fine particulate matter air pollution in the United States has fallen quite dramatically by roughly 70% since 1981. So if you look at the solid line in this graph, that's the average PM concentrations across all 65,000 neighborhoods in our data set. And we find a roughly 70% decline between 1981 and 2016. In addition, we find that absolute disparities, which I'll define as the difference in concentrations between more polluted and less polluted locations, those differences are shrinking over time. If you look at this graph, if you look at the top line and the bottom line, you see that those two lines are converging to one another. And so the basic idea is more polluted areas and less polluted areas. There's a narrower gap between them. And to be precise, the gap between, say, the 90th percentile of most polluted areas and the 10th percentile, so the 10% of least polluted areas, that gap has fallen from around 15.7 to around 4.2 between 1981 and 2016. So the good news is that likely translates into smaller differences in health and well-being effects for those living in more and less polluted areas. So that's the good news. However, when we considered relative disparities, which we defined as pretty much the following question: how does an area's pollution compare to pollution concentrations elsewhere in the United States at the same period in time? When we looked at these relative disparities, we found remarkable persistence. And this relatively straightforward graph pretty much summarizes the key point. The idea is essentially all the points you're looking at lie near this red line, which is the 45-degree line. And the basic idea is, if you look at the x-axis, it says how dirty was this neighborhood, or how polluted was this neighborhood in 1981? Was it in the 1% least polluted or the 1% most polluted? That would be near 100. And then we asked the question on the y-axis, given where you were in the distribution in 1981, where do you end up in 2016? And so if you look at a point on the far bottom left, so if you look at the x-axis, a neighborhood that was in the least polluted 1% in 1981, essentially all of those neighborhoods were in the least polluted 1 or 2% in 2016. If you want to look at the most polluted neighborhoods, if you look to the far right of the graph, what you see is the most polluted areas in 1981 are still the most polluted areas in 2016. And a key thing to note is it's not just the most and the least polluted areas. The general pattern of sort of persistence of where you are in the distribution holds at essentially every single point across the air pollution distribution. And to just put a slightly finer point on it, 94% of areas that were in the most polluted 5% in 1981 were still most polluted in 2016. 90% of areas that were in the least polluted 5% in 1981 were in the least polluted in 2016. And one of the things to note, this is not driven by urban or rural differences. These results hold controlling for that. They hold within states. They hold for the entire United States. And the basic idea is an area's rank, sort of how relatively polluted it was in 1981, is a remarkably strong predictor of how polluted it was in 2016 and how polluted it is today. So what are some implications? Well, the implications are the most polluted areas in 1981 are still the most polluted areas today. The least polluted areas in 1981 are still the least polluted areas today. And I'm happy to come back to these two slides, but I think it makes a lot of sense to just reinforce now that one reason you might care about that is that socially disadvantaged or socioeconomically disadvantaged communities are far more likely to have higher levels of fine particulate matter at any time since 1981. And if anything, relative disparities across socioeconomic groups are growing over time. So areas that were whiter and richer in 1981 became relatively less polluted and that generally holds for other vulnerable groups, as you'd anticipate. So from a socioeconomic and a race or ethnicity perspective, the most exposed subpopulations to fine particulate matter remain constant over the time. It's the same subpopulations. And if anything, the relative disparities in the United States are getting worse. So to put that assertion in some context for perspective, someone living in the most polluted areas of the United States today, which is disproportionately Hispanic, lower income, other minority groups, someone living in the most polluted neighborhoods in the United States today are exposed to the same level of fine particulate matter as the average American was more than 30 years ago. So our findings show that relative disparities persist. Basically, our main story holds for the overwhelming majority of census tracts. If you're seeing white on this map or light colors essentially suggest that the average change in your rank, where you were in terms of most and least polluted, that says that didn't change at all over time. We do see a few localized changes. So if you look, say, Ohio, West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, the Northeast Corridor, those areas became slightly less polluted relative to other parts of the United States over time. Southern California, South Texas, and the oil and natural gas fields of Eastern Oklahoma and Western Arkansas became relatively more polluted over time, again, relative to other parts of the United States. So tying this all together, why does this matter? So when we were thinking about this, maybe the easiest way to think about it is just ask the question, well, pollution has fallen. Shouldn't we just accept the win and say this is great news? And there, as I mentioned, there is some great news in here. However, the notions of fairness, equity, and justice are inherently comparative. We absolutely care about who is disadvantaged and who is advantaged at any given point in time and through time. And our results suggest that from an air pollution perspective, who is disadvantaged and who is advantaged has remained remarkably constant through time. This also has some implications for public policy. We'll take a big picture perspective for the purposes of this talk, but the implications are as follows. First, federal and state public policies for the environment require that people and places enjoy the same degree of environmental protection and that no group should bear a disproportionate burden from pollution. While real progress has been made in reducing air pollution on average, we have made essentially no progress in reducing relative disparities. So if a goal of environmental policy is, as stated, to reduce relative disparities across subpopulations and vulnerable populations in the United States, we may need more extensive and targeted environmental policies. So that's pretty much what we have for you. We're excited to hear your questions. While I open up the Q&A box, maybe an appropriate transition point is for me to ask Jonathan one question first. So Jonathan, a super common question we hear is, what are the next steps?
Well, in terms of the next steps, we've got a lot on at the moment. We're doing a lot of research. On the research front, we're working on projects to understand environmental inequality across a variety of other measures of environmental risk. But we're also wanting to dig deeper into understanding the sort of the why questions. Why do these disparities exist and why have they persisted over time? We're also in the process of raising funding for a policy tool that translates our research that Jay has just presented into a website that policymakers, NGOs, journalists, researchers, and the general public can use to visualize and better understand environmental quality at the neighborhood level. So the idea is that when you log on to the website, you'll see a map of the United States, similar to the ones that we showed you, but you can navigate these maps. You can zoom in or out, and alongside the neighborhoods that you're interested in looking at, you can get information, facts, figures about environmental quality, and you can understand how high pollution is in your area, and where your neighborhood stands in the local, state, or national distribution, all at a click of a button. And so we're excited about that. It's a work in progress. It's going to be a while before it's live, but that's sort of one of the more policy engagement tools that we're working on to translate our research into being useful, not just for researchers, but also for policymakers and the general public.
Well, that sounds super exciting, Jonathan.
Yeah, it is.
Nice work. Let me see, we got some questions that came in. I hope that we'll continue to get some more. Let me start with some more detailed questions, and then we'll move up to the bigger picture. So a couple of detailed questions. Given that factors like soil types, flooding potential, airshed topography, underlie land use, settlement patterns, etc., is it reasonable to assume they also predict inequity versus just public policy doing this or other mechanisms? And then would changing zoning be more effective than, say, the Clean Water Act?
So I think these types of questions, trying to understand why disparities exist and sort of what's been the driving forces, not only to disparities, but also why pollution has fallen, is really the question that we all want to know the answer to. What we've done so far is really to document the facts in a systematic way. And this highlights the scope and scale of the disparities and the changes in pollution that we've seen. But we don't really fully understand why disparities exist or why pollution has fallen. Like you mentioned the Clean Water Act. In terms of air quality, the Clean Air Act has also been very important in terms of reducing pollution. But it's important to remember that, what we observe is that every location in the United States has effectively experienced a 70% reduction in pollution. Jay's figure showed that pollution reductions have been largely proportional. And so whilst policy has been a contributing factor to this, there are broader changes as well, broader aggregate changes that we don't really fully understand. And so that sort of is something we need to do a better job of understanding in terms of why pollution has fallen. In terms of why disparities have persisted, there's a number of possibilities. It could be that zoning is part of it, right? So to some degree, people choose where they live. And without being too reductionist about it, we think that each person wants to live in the best place that they can afford. And so to some degree, this suggests that environmental inequality could be simply about income inequality or racial inequality. It could just be sort of the broader fundamental causes that effectively are determining exposure to the environment. But it's not necessarily that simple, right? Evidence suggests that people of color may not have the same choices as white people. And so if you're able to choose from a set of if you're only able to choose from a set of bad outcomes, then there are more fundamental constraints that need to be addressed rather than just saying, oh, people choose where they live. So people choosing where they live could be part of it. But in the case of air pollution, there's also a sense in which pollution chooses where it lives. Firms are going to choose where to set up shop, right? They may do this based on, we think that they do this based on costs, wages and land prices in a given area. But it's also, again, going to be based on the set of choices that are available to them. And this is going to be dependent on things like zoning. So understanding sort of choice sets for both, individuals and families, as well as for firms, is an important factor. And along this dimension is the sort of intersection of the role of regulation and the regulatory process. And we think that there is a sort of a political consideration here. Citing decisions where firms can go and policy outcomes are inherently political in nature. And so we think that to some degree, the louder your voice, the more of a say you have in these decisions. And so there is a concern that disenfranchised communities may be less likely to have a voice or a seat at the table. And this might be an important factor in shaping the distribution of environmental quality and environmental inequality. So this is all to say that we have a set of possible explanations, but not really a good understanding of their relevance. And so working to understand these sort of specific ideas of the role of environmental factors, the role of policy factors, the role of political factors in explaining why disparities exist and why they persisted is really part of our broader research agenda. And in our view, just a final point on this, we strongly believe that this is going to require a more interdisciplinary approach.
You're doing better than I would, but let me re-ask the final point of that question before moving to the next question, which is, would changing zoning or more targeted policies be more effective than sort of a holistic policy like the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act in addressing disparities?
So I don't know. I guess there is a point that is specific to the zoning idea. I mean, where that sort of suggests that where some people can live in some locations and others can live in other locations, and simply moving people around, if I'm understanding the question, and Jay, feel free to chip in, but that side of things, place-based policies like zoning and to some degree things like the Clean Air Act, they're also place-based. They're trying to target specific areas based on specific characteristics. And it's hard to know whether those things will be effective. The underlying all of this is the factors that I mentioned, that people can choose where to live. And so there is a sense in which when you change zoning restrictions or change policy, that people will move and that will affect their choice, the choices of where they can live. But whether it's better than environmental policy specifically, I don't know. That's kind of what we want to understand. It might be the case that I would think that to date, environmental policy doesn't seem to have by itself reduced disparities. I mean, that's what we've observed, right? I mean, we do see that the Clean Air Act is one of the stronger correlates of improvements in relative disparities. But even though that's the case, this hasn't translated into improvements for minority populations and disadvantaged populations overall. And so to take a more focused point on wanting to address environmental inequality suggests maybe that we need to have a more targeted approach, specifically focusing on inequality.
Good. We chose you to answer the questions because you're younger and smarter, but I'm not throwing you softballs. So that's that really is. I'll just reiterate that I think our first order goals is characterizing the extent of disparities and trying to understand them on a systematic level, since we haven't been able to do that before, and to exploit some extraordinary data and some data science and economic methods to understand these questions better. We have some high-level policy prescriptions, but the actual detailed policy prescriptions really matter, and they really hinge on the mechanisms that you mentioned, Jonathan. And so I'm totally with you. I'm torturing you with great questions from our audience, but I think that is the right answer. An additional question was, what is the correlation between racial disparity and urbanization? Are these disparities that we're seeing, are they attributed to racial differences in urbanization?
So one of the things that we see in terms of environmental disparities is that, I'll come to racial disparities shortly, but in terms of the environmental disparities, which was the focus of our paper, we don't see that these are driven solely by urban areas. It's not the case that this is just a simple urban versus rural comparison. In terms of more broader changes in demographics over time, it has been the case that the suburbs have become more diversified over time, whereas urban areas have become more white. We've seen white people moving into more urban areas. And so that has work by our co-author John Voorhees alongside Reed Walker and Janet Curry has sort of suggested that some of the reductions in these absolute disparities can be attributed to a diversifying of relatively cleaner suburban areas and white populations moving into relatively dirtier, more urban locations. As for racial disparities in urbanization specifically, I don't have a good grasp of what the stylized facts are there. I don't know if that answers the question fully.
Yeah, I think we get there. The one thing I would just add is that our fundamental results that the most polluted areas in 1981 are still the most polluted areas in 2016. The least polluted areas are still the least polluted areas. The most exposed subpopulations are still the most exposed. That result is not at all due to urbanization versus rural. So we were very careful to take care of that. One other thing I'll just broadly note, I mentioned this in passing while discussing the paper, is that this result is not just true on a national level. This result holds every bit as strongly in every state considered individually and basically within states as well. So the short answer is, this does not appear to be driven by urban-rural distinctions. This is a broader pattern. Jonathan, in the along the lines of still focusing on some more detailed questions before moving to the big picture, one of our attendees asked, well, the hotspots by the Mexican border suggest that the U.S. may be suffering from bad air blown across the border, as well as domestic production. Can you confirm that? Should the U.S. be pressing Mexico harder to reduce fine particulate matter?
Okay, so I think this question sort of gets into wanting to understand sort of the particular mechanisms underlying where the pollution is coming from. And I think that's also similar to another question we've had from Laura, who was asking about sort of whether agricultural waste is a source of the pollution as well. And the answer to both of these questions is we don't really know precisely what the sources of the pollution are. With respect to the question about the Mexican border, it might be the case. We can't confirm that. We don't know. We haven't analyzed that specifically. And what I would say is that we do observe that the pollution concentrations are highly localized. So yes, pollution is transported, but when it is transported, it does disperse more. And so even within sort of, even within this sort of a local area, there is substantial variation in fine particulate matters within a location. So within Charlottesville, for example, we see that there is a reasonable amount of variation across neighborhoods in Charlottesville itself. It's not just sort of this huge sort of cloud of pollution that's sort of everywhere within a rough area is being exposed in the same way. And so it certainly is going to be the case that transportation of pollution from one location to another is a contributing factor. But we don't know how much of a contributing factor it is, and so aren't in a position to sort of make policy prescriptions as to what should be going on along that front, I would say.
Yeah, that of course is the sensible, reasoned, and thoughtful answer to the question. Let me give a less thoughtful answer to the question, which is it is true that we're seeing these patterns. We're seeing relative disparities increase along the U.S.-Mexico border. I think it's worth noting that we're also seeing enormous persistence elsewhere in the United States, and we're also seeing disparities worsen in other parts of the country beyond just the U.S.-Mexico border. I think this is a broader set of circumstances that are important for U.S. environmental policy. So if I were focusing on the policy implications, I think me personally, my starting point would not be focused on pressing Mexico harder. I think this is a broader set of issues. There's no question that changes over time. One of the mechanisms that Jonathan alluded to are changes in industrial composition and the location of highly polluting or energy intensive production. And there's no question that what we find is that within the United States, we have seen a real reallocation of industrial production towards the U.S.-Mexico border. So I think that would be probably a more productive place to start than a discussion of pressing Mexico, although of course these issues relate to a host of environmental things that involve cross-country discussions. So, Jonathan, a sort of broader question. Do you see local governments being able to effectively combat air pollution inequality in economically disadvantaged communities? This particular question referenced the Dillon's rule restrictions, but essentially, what do you see sort of more local governments doing to combat this issue? And maybe I'll even add a question. Do you see that the appropriate scope for targeting this problem is at the local level rather than the national level?
So I think it comes down to information fundamentally. In order for anyone to do anything, you need to know what the problems are, right? You need to know what the scope and scale of the issues are. And I think until now, we haven't really had sort of a systematic understanding of what these issues or what environmental disparities have been and how much they've persisted. And that's sort of the objective of what we're trying to achieve with the website, the policy outreach tool, is to make this information as easily accessible to anyone, whether it's you as an individual or to local governments or state governments or national governments, so that policymakers, journalists, NGOs, activist groups can all have access to this information in a way which can help to make a difference. And so I think, I do think that local governments can be effective or could be effective in combating air pollution inequalities. But in order to do that, you have to be informed about what the scope of the problem is in the first place and have to want to do something about it. And so I think that kind of comes down to them, and that relates to the point that I mentioned previously about sort of the intersection or rather the point of the political engagement, right? If you're engaged civically with your local community, if you're engaged in the political conversation, then you have a louder voice, you have more of a seat at the table, you're able to more actively engage with these issues, and that's more likely to deliver change on these fronts. And so on Jay's point about the national versus the local considerations, I mean, this is, I think this is a national issue. But coming back to the ideas of information, as economists, one of the things that we think in terms of public economics is that
Jonathan, don't tell them we're economists.
No, oh, sorry.
They're all going to drop off.
But one of the things that we think is important from a policymaking perspective is that you want people to be acting at the level where they have the most information. And so a national government making decisions at a local level is going to be much less targeted and much less effective than having the buy-in from local governments who on the ground know what the issues are and can more effectively engage in those issues. And so I think it's a national problem, and I think that we need to have national policy that sort of sets an agenda and provides funding for engaging in these engaging in environmental inequality issues. But in terms of action on the ground, I think it will likely be much more effective having efforts acting at the state and the local level. That's my 2 cents.
I'll take it. I think that was a great answer and much appreciated. I will say at the Batten School, from a multidisciplinary perspective, we often struggle with the questions of appropriate federalism. So which policies should be shaped at a regional or federal level versus at a state or local level. And these are conversations that we have a lot. I think your answer, Jonathan, really gets at the broader issues of environmental federalism or federalism in an environmental policy context. And I agree wholeheartedly with everything you say. The one big picture comment that I'll bring it back to is just the observation that for better or for worse, I think we all have our own perspectives on this. A signature issue of federal and state environmental policies is that no group should be disproportionately exposed to pollution of any sort, and that all people should have the same access to environmental protection and environmental policy. I can say as a direct result of our paper, if a goal of U.S. and state environmental policy is to reduce relative disparities, we're falling short. And so I think It's worth noting that while some solutions will absolutely involve local governments and the unique information they have, these policy goals have been prominently set at a higher level. And on those dimensions, I think we're not meeting our broader policy objectives.
So I think we've somewhat answered Annabelle's question about policies, insofar as we don't know, but we have an idea of where the problems might be, and then by understanding what the problems are, we can sort of have a more precise answer to what policies might be most effective. The sort of two questions that sort of stand out to me is remaining are one on, so Lena Lewis asks, will our data set be available to the public before the website? It currently is available. So all of our data, all of our code is available on a data repository. So you can, it's cited in the paper. It's available on our website, on the Environmental Inequality Lab website. And so you can go and you can download the data, but it's not user friendly. It's it's for researchers to be able to take these huge amounts of data and process them, and it takes a large amount of computational power and experience with statistical coding and computer programming. And so that's kind of what motivated the website idea, which is to say, like, the amount of requests we've had for data from local governments and from NGOs since the paper was published saying, oh, can you provide us information on what air pollution is like in our location? And we can. It takes time though, and it's costly. And so we were like, okay, well, let's invest in a website where people can easily download, process data and visualizations of that data and the stylized facts at the click of a button. And that's where we're engaging. So if you want the data for research purposes and you have some background in, computer science and computer programming, then it's there and you can use it. But in a more user-friendly way, that's still not the case, and that's what we're working towards.
Awesome. Let me say that we had pretty much targeted around 45 minutes, and the pace of questions coming in has slowed. We are super grateful to all of you. I think an appropriate place to close is this question from an anonymous attendee. And I'm certain you were trying to avoid answering this question, which is why you skipped it in your last read. But it's a useful one.
It is.
What can individual citizens or consumers do to combat environmental disparities?
That's a great question. I wasn't trying to avoid it. It was the second of the two questions, but then I kind of got carried away with answering the first of the two questions. So thank you for reminding me. So, I mean, the work is systematic, but again, it comes back to information. In order to do something, you need to be informed. And so that's why we want a systematic understanding of what's going on. But for you as an individual citizen and consumer, what can you do? Well, you're a voice. And so you can contact your elected official. You can volunteer and support environmental justice groups. You can donate to environmental justice groups. Some great ones are the Environmental Justice Foundation, the Southern Environmental Law Center, and then the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. All of these organizations and many others actively engage in issues relating to environmental justice and environmental inequality. And so being informed, spreading the news, and sort of highlighting that these issues have and continue to be an important issue is important.
We got a question, any books or something you would recommend to keep one informed? I think the question comes from Professor Telotrillo. I think we have a good answer to him within economics. I think the organizations you mentioned are the best answer outside of economics.
I think so. There have been a few books written recently, but I would direct you to those organizations. And yeah, if I come up with any other sort of specific examples, I'll post them on Twitter.
Great. And Laura and Sebastian will follow up on your more specific questions and requests. To all of you participating in this webinar, we are ridiculously grateful to you for your interest, and please feel free to follow up. And yeah, these are strange times, so stay safe, Stay well and hang in there and keep us posted. Thanks so much.
Thank you
Thanks
so
to
much.
Millie and Jeff.
Yes, thank you both.